Happy Friday, everyone.
Yes, happy Friday.
Hello there.
Oh.
All right, Miss Alice, let's keep the ball rolling. We have lots and lots of content today, therefore, and lots of discussions. We have lots of visualizations prepared that we may get to. The session today will be more or less a little bit of an open forum, and we'll start a little bit different today in comparison to what we usually do. We actually start with the questions first because there were so many questions that came about, which is really good. But before we do that, Alice, you want to hit the road?
Yep, absolutely. So morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's session. So just our standard housekeeping for today. If you do have a question, please raise your hand or put it through the chat feature. As Mark mentioned, we really hope today is going to be an engaging one, and based off the questions we saw come through pre-submitted, we think it'll be a great one for today. So our panel for today is Mark and Ryan, and yeah, over to you guys now.
Thank you so much. Hey, Ryan, how are you doing?
I am doing well, slightly cold, but looking forward to summer. We'll be here soon and looking forward to the session as well.
Yeah, excellent. Well, look, I hope that the sun will shine at the end of the session with lots of smiles and new information. So today's agenda really is all about data analysis in the PPM world. And just so that we outline a little bit of an agenda of what we're going to go through today, it's not so much the tools and visualizations which will form part of it, but we really want to start by outlining what it actually means to live in a data-driven PPM world from a data strategy perspective. We want to talk about the struggles that you have right now, and thank you so much for submitting a lot of those questions already, which is really good. We then want to go a little bit through a concept that we call less is more, ensuring that we actually have user adoption and true and introducing a true data-driven decision-making capabilities and how that could happen. We want to outline how we actually design visualizations and insights so that you have a bit of a methodology or process to go through, allowing you then to provide the right visualization for your team. And at the end, I also want to outline dashboards and insights is one thing, but how can I ask ad hoc questions quickly? Your boss comes to you, has a question saying, hey, I need to know ABC and I need to know that by 3 o'clock. And how can you do those kinds of ad hoc data-driven analysis, which we thought is important. Now, the main takeaways, of course, for us today is really the importance of a well-defined data strategy. Look, we are capturing so much data these days. We need to ensure that we have that right underlying foundation so that we know data is actually used. Otherwise, it is a useless time to maintain those. Best practices for accelerating a data-driven transformation with a couple of processes and methodologies that you need to have. And of course, how do we overcome that change management challenge, ensuring that users on one hand have a high level of data maintenance. Consumption of the data on the other hand means that how can I make trustworthy decisions into the future? And then last but not least, how to ensure that data is fit for purpose and actually accessible for all of the people that needs them in all levels of those. So as I said earlier, we actually thought we are going to start with questions first. Now, usually that's something that we do at the end, but this time there were so many questions already defined that I sort of grouped them a little bit into sort of report-centric questions, user-centric questions, strategy and tools questions, and other questions that may not quite fit into this particular part. And as we go through the questions, I thought I'm going to outline a little bit how we actually do that at Sensei, and hopefully we can therefore then also give you a little bit of advice on how these things work. All right. Now, let's start with some of the questions. And Ryan, I hope you had the opportunity to have a bit of a look through. Oh, where's my mouse? Is here. All right. Well, you know what? Let's start with the report-centric questions. I thought I highlighted them a little bit of what I saw is really important. You know, what is the baseline benchmark to qualify or disqualify the status quo as data-driven or not so? So really, what kind of quality data do we need in order to make sure that we become data-driven? I think is sort of that overarching question. Now, in our experience or in your experience, how do you think we can define that benchmark for an organization?
To me, and reflecting on a few clients we've had, there's a difference between gathering and showing for the sake of it and not using it, versus actually making decisions with it and having managers using this data. So to me, a benchmark is that someone actually wants the data and someone is taking the data, turning it into information, and then changing their behavior as a result. So they're making a decision. So yes, we need to capture it. We need to also then transform it into something. So now it's on a dashboard, for example. It's not just a flat list. And that needs to show something, an indicator or a graph that can start getting towards, can it predict the future or not? We're becoming data-driven to me when we can actually start getting a hint as to where we are going, as opposed to only, hey, there's one little thing I should look at. It's more what's about to happen.
Yeah, which is interesting because it actually also means, let me just, go back here. It also goes a little bit into that strategic thinking, right? Where and there were some questions on the strategy and tool, and I want to drill a little bit more into that baselining and foundation. How do we actually build this up? So one of the questions, of course, on how should Power BI data sets contain all project management information? So that's more tools related, and I'll come back to that, I promise you. But really, how to use the data, the predictive analytics to, I'm going to say, decision making. In that instance, they say to accelerate project portfolio planning, of course. But in order for us to really ensure that we have trustworthy data, we need to have an underlying strategy of data, right? And I think that's really, really key.
We absolutely do. We also need to, as part of that strategy, and I know you'll get into this a little while later, is the completeness of data and how to keep it complete. We can have the fanciest strategy, the fanciest dashboards, but if we don't have complete coverage of data, we can't actually predict. We're predicting on an incomplete model at that point. So it's one in, all in terms of this. And so I think that getting to that point is in terms of sort of a hierarchy here, it's like you have to actually have all the data before you can do something with the data.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I will be because we've got quite a lot of stuff prepared, and I'll jump around a little bit depending on where we are. But let's stay a little bit with that data structure and the data strategy, and the importance of that. You know, why is data driven so important from a data strategy perspective? Well, the first thing that I would like to do is actually just open up a poll. Alice, if you could do that. And really the question that we're posing is, what is data strategy for you? Is it just collecting a lot of data? Is it the automation of the reports through data? Or is it decision making based on meaningful data? When you look at your current work base, what would apply most to you? Let's have a look what we have. 17 respondents. I know we've got 36 people, so we wait a little bit more, and it's super interesting to see already some of the results clearly. Decision making based on meaningful data is the ultimate reason why we implement a data strategy. Now 33, okay, we'll leave the other 5, and obviously the data will be shared with you at the end of the session. But bringing this a little bit further, I can actually see that very clearly on on the way that our customers are implementing a data strategy. Now for us, it always is, well, I call it decision making about the future. So, you know, in a very well cynical way of talking, predicting the future is ultimately what we're trying to do. Yes, analyze historical data so that we can make the right decisions, but ultimately it is really predicting the future with the data strategy that we have. And we came across, when you think about it from a holistic way, we came across it's called the AI hierarchy of needs. So ultimately, the idea for us when we are thinking about data strategy, we are thinking about how can we grow in an organization in maturity to ultimately reach the goal of having data not only available to us, but having a mechanism and intelligence that helps us making the right decision. And that's really where AI comes into place. Now, in a couple of months' time, we will actually have a wonderful Ask the Expert session about AI that Ryan and I are going to run. So I'm not going to go directly into AI. However, I want to make sure that we understand the way that a strategy is actually generally built. So first of all, we need to understand what type of data we collect, and that's what we do. And we do this in a whole bunch of different ways. These days, we do this in Excel spreadsheets. We do this in a SharePoint list, or sometimes in a solution in 2 or 3 different solutions. For us, it is then, of course, the question, where do we store that information? How do we move the data so that we have that combined storage that allows us then to transform and explore the data that we need in order to make the right decision. Once we have the transformation, we then have the ability to aggregate the data. And that aggregation will give us that bigger picture based on all of the puzzle pieces that we maintain and collect throughout the day of work. We then have to come to the point where we start to learn about the data, because these days most PMOs, and I see that in the PPM environment, they consolidate the information and they have that picture. It's almost like a snapshot. Here's my monthly report or my monthly PPM report. This is how the progress is. But how can we then utilize that data, learn and optimize so that we can actually provide a better PPM outcome? No? And that's, I think, a super important part, which then leads us to the end result, that once we have that optimization and once we continue to learn from the collecting and aggregation of information, we then have the ability for us to allow technology, the digitalization, to automatically make decisions for us, for some, at least for some mundane parts, right?
Mark, do you, just a bit of a side-based question here, do you think the maturity level of PMOs and project management within organizations is actually related to this hierarchy of needs? I'm thinking possibly not, because if I'm immature, I'm still doing work, I can still gather good data on an immature process.
It depends where you want to have the outcome, right? And if you think about it from a PPM perspective, and let's break that down a little bit more into the governance factor. What is the ultimate purpose of PMOs and PPM for that matter? And if you think about it, ultimately, you want to be able to utilize that data to execute your strategy. So the maturity level of data, collecting data is one thing, and I think PMOs are actually quite good with that. They're just not very good with it often to store the information in a manner that reduces administration by double handling, that ensures that data that is collected actually is meaningful, and that the user who collects the data understands why that data is ultimately collected. We'll get a little bit more into that when we answer some more questions in the mechanics of that. But from a PMO perspective, I do see that ultimately we want to come to the point where we automate governance and have the ability to predict the future outcome of all of the initiatives that I execute. I think that's super important. All right. Now, by the way, you know, we don't come up with that stuff. we are just very close to the industry, and we keep on looking, what's beyond the current horizon and the second and third horizon. And we always look to organizations that are quite independent. Gartner is one of them. For those of you who have been in those sessions, you will see that we continuously refer to them because they are this independent body that objectively searches the market. Now, I've got a couple of slides on that Gartner provides in the context of data practices and the support of businesses and business processes and what that actually means from a data perspective. We will provide you, I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. We'll send that to you, of course, at the end of the session. But look, the key takeaway here for us is really to build trust and accelerate decision making. That's ultimately what Gartner says as well, and they predict certain things that are coming over the next 4 to 5 years, in particular when it comes to data and decision making. You can see here, for example, by 2025, 95% of decisions that currently use data will be at least partially automated. That's where this AI is starting to come into place, where data strategy is so important that when you maintain and enter data, that just automatically will be automated behind that. Again, I'm going to go a little bit faster through that because I have quite a lot of content. Same with the analytics, the BI and the data science behind that. Again, they're predicting that, the learnings of the data that we collect will ultimately make organizations decide what to do with AI. And I think that's really key here. And that's where that hierarchy, the AI hierarchy of needs comes into data strategy. I know this is not just PPM related. PPM is a slice of that bigger picture. However, I want to point out how important it is to have those data strategic parts that then ultimately leads us to the artificial intelligence of data. And as you can see, Gartner also, the top predictions on artificial intelligence in 2022 has lots to do with machine learning, has lots to do with transforming models and making decisions for you so that you don't have to make those mundane decisions. So that's all about strategy and data strategy. When I look back at the outcome of our poll, we need to make decisions, and therefore that data strategy is super important. So for all of you out there, if you are unsure about your organizational data strategy, maybe it does make sense to actually sit down and say, okay, what do we actually do when it comes to capturing data and utilizing them meaningfully? Okay, again, I'm going to jump a little bit around here and want to just go back to my initial questioning. And I'm sorry, I have to do it this way because I don't know any other way to do that. And really want to go into the struggles when it comes to collecting data. So here are some questions that were asked, Ryan, that are very interesting. How do we ensure data connectivity that allows us to track cleanly in reporting and visual tools the life cycle of a project from initiation all the way through to the end of the life? Are there any key components or factors we should considering, which is one of those questions. Also, are there any examples that we can show when it comes to trend analysis? I will show some examples that hopefully will be a little bit invigorating, but really it comes to the challenges of building a data-driven culture, I'm going to call that, because this first is one of those examples that says, hey, how can I visualize where I currently am? And we can do that. But how do you ensure that the data is continuously maintained? That challenge of trustworthy data. How do you think organizations deal with that?
For me, it's really, if we're talking end to end here, they're talking about the life cycle of a project or product from initiation through to end of life. You have to define the life cycle first. It's a process question. We know we can visualize it. This is a matter of imagination and technology. But how are you going to use the tool you've been given to visualize? What are you going to feed into it? So we need to be able to define the process end to end. We need to then build in with the data comes, it's not just a database, it's the mechanism to keep it up to date, which means enabling that process. Digitizing the process will give us the data we need anyway, which will feed the visualization, which then gives us the decision making on the process. So
Well,
we kind of look at a complete strategy.
Yeah, look, and I think the user adoption is really the key here, the ability for us to determine why are we maintaining that data. And I think that's where a lot of those struggles are when it comes to organizational PMOs and PPMs, continuous user adoption, ensuring that we provide the full picture, right?
There's an anecdote, if I could share with us quickly, on this user adoption thing that's good for data. Now, some of you, I've used this before in these sessions, some might remember it. Is a major Australian airline. We were involved with them in essentially building the PMO for a big transformation project. The way we got users to adopt it and use the system was by starting at the end. Don't talk to the user, don't even talk to the PMO. We went to an executive and we said, hey, Mr. Executive, what do you actually need? He didn't understand this IT thing we're doing and there's a project system. He didn't care. What he cared about was an A3 piece of paper that he drew out. I need a report that tells me these things. So we built him that report and we worked backwards. I know Mark's going to get into it, but this is where the nice anecdote comes in. Every Monday, this guy went to his PA and she printed off a copy of this report for him. It gave him a snapshot of this $100 million program that they were doing. He had like a compendium he carried around. He carried this thing with him. He'd go into a meeting. He would purposefully make people see him unfold his piece of paper. And if Mark, for example, said, I need resources or I need budget or whatever, he would look at it. He'd drag his finger over the piece of paper and say, no, sorry, Mark, I can see your project here. You're under budget. You're fine. You don't need anything. The data's telling me you're fine. Don't worry about it. So next. And in that way, it within weeks made people's behavior change because they saw how the data was being used to make decisions. They just fell into line. It was the most amazing thing to see.
That is very interesting. And again, I know I'm flipping around with my PowerPoint slide deck, but I wanted to make sure that we actually understand how that practically looks like. So, and that's really the first pass. I'll come back to what are your challenges, and there's actually another poll. But before I do that, I wanted to make sure that we inhale what Ryan just said, because I always refer to that as less is more. How often do we have project managers needing to maintain data that doesn't end up somewhere? And I think that's really key. So for us, we always ensure that data maintenance needs to be made easy and needs to be fit for purpose. And Ryan, I think your example is a prime example that translates in our world at Sensei, at least, to the point where, to the point where we call that the 4 steps definition of data maintenance. How do we ensure that data is actually maintained in an organization? Well, and as you quite rightly pointed out, the first step has to be the outcome, the end result. Define and design the visibility that is required from all levels. Let's, as an analogy, we use the executive as one of them, but it also is key stakeholders. It is project, program, portfolio managers. It even goes down to the team members. So determine the visualization that you need, the insights that you need in order to make decisions. That's absolutely the first step of that. From then on, you can actually, let's do that example on an executive level. As you said, you know, the executive came about, he wanted to have a picture and wanted to make a decision based on this picture, which leads us to one of the key components of user adoption and ensuring that change management. The change management actually happens at the executive level. They need to be able to trust the information. Part of the organization that captures information needs to understand that decisions are made against that data. So that's for us the first part that we always do, start with the end result. From then on in, we actually then go down the path of the time determining in the PPM space about what kind of project types do I have? Major, minor, what type of methodologies do I have? Waterfall, agile, and how do I in an organization execute my type of projects? How do I classify them? I think that's very important because one project does not fit all. You know, a lightweight project needs to be treated different than a CapEx project that goes over many years. But from an executive perspective, it needs to still have that same picture. You know, the example is when I look at a profit and loss statement, I don't mind whether this is an invoice that it contributes to that profit and loss statement that's $1 or $1,000. It needs to have the complete picture. In the project management world, that's the same part. From then on in, you know the type of information or the type of projects and information that you need to capture. And then you need to make sure that you agree on the governance. And the governance really is outlined on the different stage gates. Yes, you may have an agile project. Yes, you may have a waterfall project, but there is a governance component that needs to be the overarching governance component of all of those projects. That will allow me to determine the life cycles. The question that was asked earlier, how do I provide that overarching picture? Make sure that you have that governance across all of the project types that you currently face. And from then on in, all you then need to do is convert these data activities into your solution, whatever that may be. In our world, it's of course Sensei IQ or as the project portfolio management solution, but it is that user experience that the user understands why they maintain the data. And I always visualize that where I say, hey, I've got a portfolio report. I've got a particular value in that portfolio report that is required to make decisions. And this is where the data comes from. So project manager 1 needs to be able to enter that data so that we can get the outcome of that well-defined PPM visibility. Data-driven decisions will drive user adoption. It will take a little while, but if I know as a project manager that the information that I report against will be used for decisions, and these are the type of decisions that will be made because of that, then I maintain my data much more consciously than subconsciously, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So sorry, I know again I'm floating around a little bit, but I thought that was actually a very interesting part for us.
You're currently sharing an email, Mark.
Oh, yeah. No, that's not an email. Sorry. Thank you. That's all right. There we go. So that's the part that we have actually left for originally. Okay, so bringing us back to the data struggles that you have right now, would you mind opening up one of the polls? And Alice, if you could just forward that on. You know, what are your current biggest struggles with data? And again, I've got a couple of examples. I don't get any data at all, or the data I get is not trustworthy, or I have too much data and don't know what to do with it, or the dashboards and reports that I get are just meaningless, or hey, I'm super happy and I don't have any challenges. And if you tick this on, I want to talk to you, because then we can learn lots and lots of it, I think.
Yeah, we want to hire that person. But the fact that the dashboards and report I get are meaningless is really interesting. I thought that had happened. Yeah. Actually, the data I get is not trustworthy as well. There's so much effort where people are building dashboards all the time, but they haven't thought about the strategy and no one uses it.
Yeah, look, and it's really interesting. We knew that obviously the data is not trustworthy is one of the main components, and it's a combination of things. But before we share our experience, I'd love to actually open up that the forum and want to have a bit of an open discussion around, in particular, around trustworthiness of data and potential mechanisms that you put into place in order to ensure that the data is trustworthy. What's your experience in maintaining data and ensuring that the information is continuously maintained in your environment? All right, let's have a look at some of that. There are some in the text part. Haley, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. We've got a internal enterprise project management system, and our project management office staff QA, QC the data at each stage gate, as well as during the sort of quarterly project status updates. However, we're also the sort of landing platform for integration to our finance and HR system. And we're not the custodians of that data, but we receive it, and it's an important part of portfolio reporting.
Yes.
So I was just interested in, and some of the lack of trust in the data has come from sort of data sources outside of the project management system. Just keen if you had any experience with that and any proposed solutions.
What an interesting question, Ailey. And look, interestingly enough, I would almost call it the other way around. So what we often do is we get information from line of business system, let's say financial data. These are the actual cost for a project in accordance to what my finance department reports against. Despite the fact that I think finance generally has a more rigor governance factor when it comes to financial management, no matter where that is, you always need to make sure that the data itself remains trustworthy. And the way that you do that is, Bucky, sorry, my dog. Bucky, be quiet. Sorry. The way that you do that is to ensure that you never double handle the information, that the data that is maintained is always maintained in the source, and you then integrate that. Of course, if you get, I'm going to say HR data that is meaningless, then ultimately you need to go to that department and need to determine the issue and the solution for that. And there are different ways how you can do that in a very informal way, of course. Yes, sorry. Yes, I do have a cute dog called Bucky, and he's annoying. In a very informal way where you just simply have that conversation, or there's actually a process that we apply that we refer to as IDS, issue, discussion, resolution, solution, and where we outline this. This is how we run all of the challenges that we are working for. Because issues are issues for a different reason. Sorry, I'm going to kick this dog.
So what he means is you're going to push it into another room. It's just a bit of Germanization. You wouldn't actually kick it.
Sorry, yes. So that's one way of how we resolve that, Hayley. So make sure that the underlying governance is always there, and that's really key. Because data alone will not automatically make itself right if you don't have the right governance in place. And look, interestingly enough, I think the issue is actually mostly in the PMO space. Not having trustworthy data has a very particular reason, and that reason is because we are trying to predict the future. Yes, we have a status quo of the current status of the project, but ultimately it's predicting the future of the outcome. And trying to predict the future is always risky, and the data may not be as accurate as, well, a profit and loss statement that purely reports on actual facts that have occurred, and therefore they are trustworthy. So I think that's very important as a first step. Make sure that the actual occurrence of the project that is reported against, and then go that next step of predicting the future. When it comes to integration, yeah, make sure that once you have that integration, that you trust the data as part of that governance, and it just needs to be checked ultimately. Yeah.
And Mark, we've also got a comment from Simon. Simon, if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I love this conversation. I think it's so powerful. Mark, your four-step process for looking at data is really at the heart of, I guess, what I often see, and that is sometimes accurate reporting is inhibited by the unwillingness of the organisation to accept the truth about certain things, whether it be overspending or delays or blockages of resources that one team won't provide the other. And so ability to trust the data is a reflection of we don't have a culture that says accurate reporting is what we actually want and incentivize and stimulate, and empower the people putting the data in to know that whatever the state of affairs is, you'll be supported. It'll be okay because we actually want to know the problem and solve it. I find that's a big challenge in our organisation.
Oh, in many organizations, I hear you, to the point where we sometimes need to provide the ability to override the status quo. Let's say, project is amber for whatever reason, and then somebody, a key stakeholder, determines saying, well, no, I want to report it as green and want to override that. Well, that defeats the purpose, right? The idea of a data-driven culture is actually the other way around. Recognizing the issue, working on that, and trying to find the solution. So Simon, yes, I hear you, and I think that's one of the reasons why Excel is so famous and so loved, because you can just simply override the data, right? In a financial environment, well, if you have an invoice that costs $10 and you put that invoice into the system, it spits out the profit and loss statement based on the $10, and no one would ever think about, you know what, let's just make that $8 so that it looks a bit better. It just doesn't happen.
You would go to jail for that.
Yeah, in our world, it seems to happen that way, which is very interesting. Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Simon. Anything else from a discussion perspective? Look, I've got quite a lot of stuff to go through, and that's why I want to show some visualizations. I'm conscious of the time. We only have 20 minutes left. So I already went through this part here and wanted to outline that. However, look at the PPM not as the universe. The PPM is never the sun. The sun of an organization is the collective data that allows us to make decisions on an organizational basis. So any kind of project portfolio management related data needs to be managed in a way that I understand the bigger picture. Now, we call this the hierarchy of accountability, sorry. And what that ultimately means is, where do I fit from a corporate perspective? Where do I fit into the picture of a data-driven culture? So let's assume, Department 1 is the PMO, and Department 2 is finance or operations. A data structure needs to be defined so that we always understand why we maintain data. And I want you, if you have the time, take 10 minutes and talk to one of your project managers and ask them what data they maintain. And then look at that data and try to translate, where does that end up? If you find that data doesn't end up somewhere, scrap it, because you might as well have 5 pieces of data sets that you trust instead of having 50 pieces of data sets that no one trusts. So really, this is that hierarchy of accountability. Make sure that you understand what data you need, and also recognize that the more granular the data is that you expect a project manager to maintain, the more time you will need to give them. So if you want to do, let's say, daily resource management, well, it means that you need to give the project manager the opportunity to spend the time reforecasting on a daily basis. A lot of organizations they only ever see that outcome of the report, but then never see the underlying effort. How often has it happened that an executive came along and said, hey, I want to have a report that tells me X. If you now translate that back to the effort, you suddenly realize, hey, in order to give you that picture X, it requires 2 FTEs. Is the investment of capturing the data worth the decision that you make based on that data? That's key. If you don't have that, then argue the point and say, well, if you only look at it for the sake of it and you don't do anything with it, then it's a lost time. And that's where disefficiencies actually happen. It happens all the time, especially in the PMO, Ryan. We see this time and time again. Oh, we just need to fill this out. We maintain that once, and no one ever looks at it again.
That, and I think the concept of once you mentioned is important. If that executive is asking for something as a once-off, you have to question, why do you want it once off? Why is the process so the non-standardized that you want data once and you don't want it every month, because if you don't want the same data every month, what are you doing it for? You know, why we're not a PMO then, we're not implementing a process.
Yeah, super interesting that often we are, we are in our blinders and we just blindly follow what my boss tells me without actually questioning, is it worth the time? And I think as the PMO, sometimes we struggle that because of the, well, I call it the toothless tiger attitude, where you have lots of responsibility but very little power to question. So yeah, that's in our experience ultimately the issue of a data-driven decision-making attitude. Yeah, make sure that you understand data. This is key of everything. That's why we do what we do. Right?
Yeah,
and there are different. Sorry.
You part of, Mark, you had the corporate data, you said it's not the sun. Your little PMO is essentially part of a bigger organization. Right. The data is the universe, it's everywhere. Yes. So if you are doing things, it's questioning why I'm doing it, but it's also, if you extrapolate that out, everyone's spending a lot of time pushing data around for nothing. It's really questioning, okay, you want something, how does this fit into everything else?
That's right.
And am I supporting the big corporate picture here or not? If not, let's not do this.
Which is so important, again, bringing this back to the strategy, right? Making sure that you understand your data strategy. What do you do with data? Because ultimately that's the output of each individual in our digitalized world these days. Well, okay, I'm conscious of time and I still have so much to show, and I wanted to give you a couple of, examples of what we do from a pure output perspective. I'm not going to go into IQ or anything. I'm going to show you just a couple of examples based on the different types of output that we provide. On one hand, of course, a status update. Where am I in my current point in time? The second one is sort of trend. Hey, when has trend and governance actually combined? Hey, what's the trend of the progress of a project, and can I stipulate the outcome of that based on the trend that I see? The governance, hey, do I have the information that I need in order to trust the information? A consolidated view when it comes to, hey, this is the data from a project perspective, and that puzzle piece is forming part of a program picture, and that program picture is forming part of a portfolio picture. Wanted to show you that. And the predictive outcomes, well, I don't have a real example for that today, unfortunately, but this will have to be one of the discussion points in our AI Ask the Expert session, Ryan, because the predictive outcomes is actually the ultimate nirvana that we are trying to achieve, right? Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Now, a couple of examples, because I also want to get into the ad hoc capability. Let me just clear my parts here. And I'm just going to start. Actually, I'll start here. So what you see here right now is nothing else but Power BI. And these are all Power BI reports that we incorporate in our solution there. But that's not what I want to show you. I want to actually show you some of those outputs. Now, on one hand, when we're talking about the status update of projects, which is, I'm going to call it the lowest granularity of the information that I need to manage. This is a prime example. As a PMO, I want to be in a position to look at my status at any point in time, to the point where I can, in our instance, just simply mouse over and see just some key data here. Project status deliverables are a little behind, but being worked by the team, still have an issue to address. Okay, well, what's that issue? So from here on in, you need to have the ability to look at the detailed status. So in our instance, again, just Power BI visualization is the status of the report, and that now allows us to focus on the information. So what we do is we go then to our customer and we say, you as a key stakeholder, what kind of view do you need to have to make a decision whether this project goes on time or not? And most of the times we actually get the one-pager question. Hey, I need to have a one-pager that just gives me an overarching view, but then need to have the ability to drill into more reasoning of why that status occurs. So this is a one-pager where I can get some general information from, from date-related information, trends-related information, status-related information, and in our instance, milestone-related information. From here on in, I can then say, oh, look, actually my financials it's trending down. So it was green and now it's amber. Well, why is that? And that will then allow you to drill further into the query of that data set. So in my instance, I can see, hey, my budget is 760,000, but my estimate is only 593,000. I know what you're saying. A lot of people say, but it's under budget. That's great. Actually, for large organizations, underspend is a big issue because they are planning, but they can't execute all of the planned stuff. And that's a big problem because suddenly you have budgets available that you may be able to distribute to somewhere else. So that's why underspend is actually in that instance a trend factor that goes down. And from here, I then just simply provide the visibility where I can now look at my estimate at completion, my actuals, my variance, and I can analyze why that is. Now, the reason why we are able to do that is because every project manager has the ability to maintain their financial information in a way that you can then store the data in one spot. For us, that's the dataverse. It's like a database, but that's again part of that data strategy. Make sure that you understand where the data needs to be stored. Remember that second part of the hierarchical view in the AI hierarchy of needs. Right? So that's one of those status examples that I wanted to outline just and show how that works from one project all the way up to the selected projects. And of course, therefore, we can ascertain trends. Now, trends can happen in a whole bunch of different forms. Let me give you an example. The data is not very maintained here, but I wanted to show you what it means for us to look at trend-related information. I just need to, here. So all I did is I call it a trend report because our project managers in our system allows them to update the project status update in a very intuitive fashion, but the key again is every project manager updates them not in an Excel spreadsheet, not in a PowerPoint deck, not in a Word document. They maintain them in an online form, and that online form stores the information. So immediately, can I see from a PMO perspective, let me just bring this up, in September, which project has not been reported on in September? Immediately, can I go to the employee hardware refresh project and say, hey, why haven't I received any status update in December? With that, you can then actually bring that down if you have that an annual or even a weekly view where you can now say, hey, within a particular month, look at this tenant renewal project has actually been reported on the 1st, on the 8th, and on the 21st. And all three of them have a trend of amber. Why is that? And here I now have the ability to simply mouse over and see the project status and see some additional information. In my instance, I just use some KPIs. In here, there can be description. There can be anything that allows you to determine what trend we are going to go into. So that was another one of those examples that I wanted to show. Governance and trend happen quite often at the same time because you need to make sure as part of your governance that the project is in line with where there should be. So this is a nice example of that. And of course, as a program manager, you can say, hey, show me only my projects. Okay, I only have one project here. So you again, as long as the data is maintained in a centralized capability, you have that part. The last thing that I want to show you here is really sort of a consolidated view. So projects form part of the puzzle pieces that form part of I'm going to call it as a program or portfolio. Actually, let me go onto the program, I think, or portfolio, that's good. So each project, because the data set is the same, I now have the ability to have that consolidated, where I suddenly again, I'll stay with the finance because that's a numerical value that we often see. I stay with my finances. I can see all of my strategic portfolios that are driven off the sub-program and projects, where I have the ability to drill again into the portfolio and drill again into the details of that information. And what you see here now is again a consolidated view of the status of that portfolio. However, some of those things are automated. So risks, for example, we automatically calculate the risk factor of the portfolio because we have that maintained on the project level. And that, of course, then allows me to calculate the overarching KPIs of a portfolio. Keeping that again from a financial perspective, as you can see, the same view than we had on a project basis. However, it is now consolidated. So we talk the same language, it's just the granularity of the data that's different. And that's what a consolidated view often outlines. I'm conscious of time, we only have 10 more minutes, and clearly this is a subject that is super interesting. I encourage you to give us feedback if you want to dive a little bit deeper into some of those data-driven examples. I'm more than happy to have another follow-up session with that. This really is about the concept of understanding our data strategy, understanding on how we build the data that we need to maintain, and what type of reports we can build at the same time. Now, talking about reports, there is one part that I would like to outline when you start thinking about visualizations. Now, I call it, what will the picture tell us, and how do we actually design dashboards? The second part in our poll was, I get a dashboard or a report, but it's meaningless to me. This is actually one of the biggest issues we face. So take the time to design a dashboard that is meaningful. Here's a bit of a little bit of a methodology or process that we apply so that we ensure that we provide that right insights. So this is, and we've done this actually for many years exactly that way. For us, it's not the quantity of data, it is the quality of the reports and insights that we need to provide. And sometimes, most times, project PMOs only provide 1 or 2 or 3 dashboards in total that consolidates all of them. So therefore, it's super important that we actually design them appropriately. So first of all, acknowledge the need. What do I need to know in order to make a decision? Define those requirements. What question do I want to answer? And therefore, you can then define your specification of the data collection. From then on in, you have that information, and then you design the dashboard solution. I call it a solution. It could be a report or a dashboard. Now, the reason why I distinguish between dashboards and reports are generally printable reports, whereby dashboards provide me a picturesque, a picture of a consolidated view, so more visual. From there on in, really determine the layout. And as part of the layout, you always need to make sure that you understand the purpose and the audience, that you understand what's the purpose for that report, printable or visual, and provide supporting information behind that. Release that and test it. Make sure that the data that you get from the report is always there. That's the governance. That's the part that's very important. Make sure that you train your users on why data is maintained so that we can make that decision. Support that so that if someone has a question, hey, how do you come up with this number, that you can actually answer that question, and continuously refine the picture with the end user, with the key stakeholder, or with the user that refines that uses that information. That's a nice process way that we wanted to share with you. Remember, the first one was organizationally, what information do I need, what project types, what stage gates, and translate the user experience accordingly. This one, allows us to define that insights. What is the insight? How do I design that? And that's a very good way of dealing with that. All right. What time is it? Oh God, only 5 minutes. I would love to show you a couple of more examples. However, I don't have that. Now, the last thing that I quickly want to cover before we then open up for questions is actually the ad hoc data analysis. Look, I understand that that Power BI is the new Excel, as I like to call it. But for us, let's not forget the purpose of Excel. Excel is not a data maintenance tool. It was meant to be that way, but these days it's actually a data visualization tool. How can I determine, how can I answer a question quickly that may not form part of my standard questions that I generally need to answer? So I'll give you an example. Your finance department comes to you and says, hey, next year, I need to understand what kind of CapEx you need for the next 3 or 4 years or for next year across your projects. How do you as a project PMO determine that? And that's where those ad hoc questions and pivot questions can be answered. Let me show you a quick example. I wish I could have a little bit more time, and I'm happy to have an extra session for that. But what I've done here is done nothing else but using Excel. And in Excel, you actually have a whole way of getting data into Excel these days. In our instance, because we are using the Microsoft Power Platform, you can either get that from a data set in Power BI or directly from the Dataverse, which is the database that the information is stored. And I've done that. And what I came up with is nothing else but a report, a pivot report that gives me all of the data sets that is stored in this particular Dataverse, and then I can ask questions. For example, it was cost. So okay, forecast cost was one of these parts. So again, what you can do here is you can literally design them, and you can make it so that you can answer that kind of questions always. For example, here I'm going to use my cost type, where I have the ability now to filter that either by budget, by forecast, or by actuals. And then I'm going to put my cost item as part of the value. Oh, not sorry, cost item, my cost item, sorry, as part of the rows. And here I can already start building up the values. And then I'm going to have my cost value in here, where I can now see my forecast cost across all of my cost items. In our instance, labor cost, IT cost, CapEx, OpEx is X amount. And you can then, of course, also put that over time. Where you literally, what is it? I think I called a date here, Sensei date, where I can then just literally put that into a column and answer the question saying, hey, I don't know, labor cost in 2022 will be $10,000, and my forecast needs to be spread across those areas. So very quickly, can you answer ad hoc questions? Here's one of those examples that I made where I looked again at the project type, list of my project, and here's now a timeline across all of the different cost types. So here's my CapEx budget. I can tell my finance team that next year I need 1.7 million, the year after 3.4 million, the year after 3.4, and then 1.7 again. And again, you then have the ability to literally ask some more questions. Finance comes to you and says, but what project? And you then can literally say, well, actually, I can break this down by project, and I can tell you that my CapEx budget, here's the project number 1 that takes about $50,000, but my budget distribution project is actually the one that has most of them. So these ad hoc questions, I encourage you to utilize Excel by drawing the information into the Excel spreadsheet and utilizing that capability. It doesn't always have to be Power BI, and I think that's is important to understand. All right, I know we only have a minute left, and I know I went through a whole bunch of questions. We haven't even answered all of the questions that you submitted. We will do that as part of the information that we sent out through it, so you will have the ability to read. But before I close the session, are there any questions? All right. Well, just to summarize, data strategy is key for you to become a data-driven organization. Ensuring through the concept of having the end result and breaking down the data allows you to ensure that users will understand why they maintain data. Designing visibility in a manner that identifies the need and then designs the outcome is super important, and continuously refining that, and that's very, very important too. Yeah, that's sort of the final outcome of this particular session. This could go for another hour easily, and I could show you a whole bunch of different visualizations. I consciously didn't want to just show you reports. Happy to do that. Give us the feedback in accordance to what is important to you, and then we can, of course, have a data visualization session, for example. Ryan, anything that you need to communicate?
No, I think that just watching the chat, there are a few questions coming through there from Simon as well about let's do an example around a case study in the future. Yep, we will do that. The prediction part, we're heading in that direction very much. There is coming towards the end of sort of the series of webinars, one around prediction around AI. Look forward to that. Gonna be some good stuff there.
Yeah, watch that space, because that's always the outcome. How do we ensure that the data we collect is not just collected and gives us the status quo, but how can we predict what's going to be in the future and acting accordingly? Yeah, so that'll be an interesting one. All right, well, with that, I'm going to hand back to our wonderful Alice. Alice, please close the meeting.
No worries. Thanks, Mark. If you can just go to the next slide. Yep. So again, thanks everyone for your time today. We tried to get through as much as we could, but we know there's always lots to go through. So we'll summarize everything for you in a blog post to follow in the coming weeks as well. And we've got a couple more events scheduled in for the rest of the year. So please sign up for those events and submit your questions, and we'll be eager to get to those topics when they come around. So yeah, thanks everyone for a great session, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Cool.
Thank you, team. See you guys later. Bye.